I was 6 months pregnant when I ran into my ex-husband and his new bride at a coffee shop on what just happened to be the day of their engagement celebration. I hadn't planned to be there. I didn't even know the cafe had been remodeled into some upscale brunch place with golden chairs and eucalyptus in mason jars. I was just tired. My feet were swollen. I'd finished a prenatal checkup and needed somewhere quiet to breathe. That's all I wanted. 5 minutes to feel like I wasn't drowning. But life doesn't wait for you to be ready. I walked in, ordered a hot tea, and turned the corner to find a seat. And there they were, James and Savannah. He was laughing. That laugh I used to love. That laugh that once shook my kitchen walls when he'd tell me I was too clumsy to handle glass bowls. His hand was resting on hers like it belonged there. And she was glowing. White dress, gold heels. A tiny bump showing under her silk blouse. The kind of glow people assume means happiness, wholeness. Meanwhile, I stood there like a ghost, worn sneakers, faded maternity dress. I hadn't even brushed my hair that morning. Why would I? I didn't expect to walk into the aftermath of my own erasure. Savannah saw me first. Her eyes widened just slightly. Then, just as quickly, she tilted her head and smiled, like I was nothing but a memory, something she'd already outgrown. And then James turned. Our eyes met. He froze. And I knew. He hadn't told her. Or maybe he had. But not the whole truth. Not the truth that I was still carrying the child he walked away from. Not the truth that he had never even asked if I made it to the 3rd trimester. Not the truth that his last words to me had been, "I can't do this anymore," before he vanished with his gym bag and silence. I stood there, shaking, clutching my belly like a shield. The barista behind me cleared her throat gently. "Ma'am? Your tea?" I took it. I nodded. I turned around like I hadn't seen anything. Like nothing had happened. But something had. Something inside me cracked open. Because in that moment, standing 3 feet from the man who broke me and the woman who replaced me, I realized something. They thought I was done, but I wasn't. I found a seat near the window, far enough that they couldn't hear me, but close enough that I couldn't stop watching them. It was like staring at a photograph of a life I used to know. Only now, someone had edited me out and replaced me with Savannah. I used to think the worst pain was being lied to. I was wrong. The worst pain is being forgotten. James had a way of making women feel like they were the center of his universe. Until he was done orbiting. And then he just floated away. No crash, no fire, just a silent drift into someone else's gravity. I sipped my tea slowly. I didn't blink much. I didn't trust my body to cooperate if I moved too quickly. My hands were cold, my chest numb. I remembered the last fight we had, me crying in the hallway, holding a positive pregnancy test, begging him to look at me, to say something. He never yelled. James wasn't loud. He weaponized silence. And when I asked if he loved me, he just shook his head like he pitied me for still hoping. And now here he was, smiling like he hadn't left pieces of me behind. I didn't know if I wanted to scream or disappear. But then, I saw something. Savannah pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him. He leaned in, kissed her cheek, and said something that made her laugh. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the tone. It was rehearsed, it was practiced. It was the same way he used to speak to me when we were still fine. And suddenly, I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt dangerous. I didn't get up to confront them. I didn't cry. I didn't cause a scene. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened a blank note. I wrote one sentence. They don't get to win. Then I wrote another. They don't know who I am without him. And for the first time in a long time I smiled, not out of joy, but out of recognition. Because I wasn't just a woman he left behind. I was the woman he would regret underestimating. And this moment, wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Before all this, before Savannah, before the coffee shop, before the betrayal, I was someone else entirely. My name is Eliza Monroe. I'm 33 years old. I used to teach literature at a public high school in Portland. I wasn't glamorous. I didn't wear heels to the grocery store or post curated photos online. I believed in quiet things, books, tea, handwritten notes, slow mornings. I was the kind of woman people called sweet at parties, the kind who remembered birthdays and sent thank you cards. And I was madly, foolishly in love with James. We met at a teacher conference, of all places. He was doing a tech demo for a startup trying to get educational software into schools. He was charming, polished, good with words. I was awkward but curious. He asked me to dinner the next day, and I said yes. That was the beginning of everything. Our life together started small: a rented apartment, a shared car, Sunday dinners with my mom. But James was ambitious. He wanted more. Bigger. Flashier. I supported that. I believed in him. When he said he needed to quit his job to build his own company, I tightened our budget, took on tutoring work, and told him to chase his dream. That's who I was. The woman behind the scenes. The one who cooked, cleaned, edited his pitch decks, and kept our home running while he chased the spotlight. When we got married, I promised to be his partner. Through everything. And I meant it. We tried for a baby for 3 years. I had 2 miscarriages. The second nearly broke me. But James held me through it. Back then, I thought it meant he loved me more. Now I wonder if it just meant he hadn't found a way out yet. When I finally got pregnant again, I thought we were healing. I surprised him with the news over dinner. His favorite steak, candlelight, soft music. He didn't react the way I expected. He was quiet, distant. Said he was just processing. Looking back, that was the beginning of the end. But I didn't see it. Because I was so used to carrying things alone that I didn't notice he'd stopped helping. And by the time I realized he wasn't coming back emotionally, it was too late. He'd already left me mentally, even if his body was still in the house. I started going to doctor appointments alone. He always had an excuse. Meeting ran long, investors in town, bad traffic. I stopped asking after a while. I didn't want to hear him lie, and he didn't even bother to pretend anymore. At night, I'd lie in bed with one hand on my stomach, whispering to the baby, telling them about books, about colors, about music. James would be downstairs, always downstairs, working. But I knew he wasn't. He stopped touching me, stopped making eye contact. He never yelled. He just disappeared, inch by inch. There were clues, of course. The late nights, the cologne that wasn't his, the strange charge on his credit card, flowers I never received. I found a pair of earrings once tucked in his briefcase. He claimed they were for me, but they weren't my style. They were gold, not silver. Big, bold, flashy. I wore studs, always had. I started searching. I didn't want to be that woman, the one who snoops, but I needed to know. I went through his laptop when he left it open one night. Emails, messages, calendar invites. He was seeing her, Savannah, longer than I ever suspected. And the worst part? I knew her. She used to come into my classroom as a student mentor, smiled too sweetly, laughed too loudly, said she looked up to me. I never saw her coming. The day James left for good, he didn't even pack all his things, just a few shirts, his laptop, and his cologne. He said, "I'm sorry," and walked out. No begging, no discussion, just gone. I thought that was the worst day of my life. I was wrong. The worst came weeks later when I saw the engagement post on Savannah's page. A white dress. A beach, his hand on her stomach. She was pregnant too. It was like I'd been erased, like my pain had been overwritten with their new perfect beginning, as if I never existed. And yet, I was still here, still carrying his child, still holding the pieces of a life that no one else remembered. So when I saw them at that cafe, sitting in my city, laughing like none of it ever happened, I wasn't just heartbroken. I was ready, because I finally understood. I didn't lose everything. I was just being set free from something that was never real to begin with. I stayed in that cafe longer than I should have. I wasn't stalking, I wasn't spying, I was studying. The world they'd built was so polished, so clean. It was like watching a movie set. Everyone knew their roles, the lighting was perfect, and there was no room for error. And somehow James was thriving in it. He looked lighter. Like he hadn't left behind a wife 6 months pregnant, or skipped out on nursery shopping, or walked out in the middle of a conversation that ended with me on the bathroom floor, sobbing. Savannah had filled the space I used to occupy, and she wore it like a designer coat. I looked around the cafe. It had changed, too. Once it had been a quirky little spot with mismatched chairs and community bulletin boards. Now it was minimalist and expensive. I could smell money in the candles they used. There were reserved signs on 3 tables. Everyone looked like they belonged in a real estate commercial, including James. Especially Savannah. The barista walked by and said, "You here for the private event later?" I blinked. "What event?" "Oh, it's a soft launch party. Couple over there." She nodded toward James and Savannah. "They're investors in the cafe now. She curated the menu, and he's part owner of the building. My chest tightened. He used to roll his eyes at brunch menus. He said words like artisan were pretentious. And now? He owned this place? Savannah caught my glance again. This time, her expression was different. Not smug, not surprised. It was calculated. She knew I was there, and she didn't care. She reached for James's hand and laced her fingers through his like it was a challenge. I didn't look away. Let her look, let her see me, let her know I wasn't gone. Because what neither of them knew, what they'd never imagined, is that sometimes the quiet ones don't stay quiet forever. I watched them laugh with the staff, pose for a few photos. The barista handed them a branded tote bag with their names printed in gold cursive. Savannah and James, Founders Circle. Founders. Of course. They weren't just moving on, they were building on top of what they stole from me. I imagined what James must have told her about me, that I was fragile. Controlling, emotional, the woman who couldn't let go. It made sense now, why she didn't flinch when she saw me. In her mind, I was the ghost in his story, the weak chapter, the lesson. But I wasn't a warning, I was the plot twist. The barista brought my tea refill without asking. I smiled and thanked her softly. Then I pulled out my notebook again. I started writing. Not about them, about me, who I used to be. What I gave up, what I survived. I wrote about the lies I told myself just to keep breathing. About the nights I stared at the ceiling wondering if I was the problem. About the appointments I went to alone. About the names I'd picked out for our baby, names he never asked to hear. Page after page, not as a victim, as a witness. A record, a reclaiming. When I looked up, James had disappeared. I don't know where he went, maybe to the bathroom, maybe to breathe. Savannah was still there. She looked up from her phone, glanced around, and for a brief second, her eyes landed on me again. This time, there was no smile, just stillness. A pause, like she realized something wasn't going the way she'd planned. Good. I stood up slowly, gathered my bag, and walked past her table without a word. I didn't need to speak, not yet. But just before I reached the door, I stopped. I turned, and I smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just enough for her to know I saw everything, and I wasn't afraid anymore. Because what they built might have looked beautiful, but it was sitting on a fault line, and I was the earthquake coming for it. After I left the cafe that day, I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the folder I'd been too afraid to look at for weeks. Inside were papers I'd collected slowly, quietly, during the final days of our marriage. Credit card statements, email printouts, hotel confirmations, all small things. But together, they told a story. James hadn't just stumbled into Savannah, he'd planned it. They were messaging 2 months before he left me, booking weekends away while I was still spotting from morning sickness. I found one receipt from a resort, same place we'd gone for our honeymoon. That stung. But what crushed me was the date, the night before our wedding anniversary. So while I'd been cooking his favorite meal and laying out candles, he'd been in bed with her. And the worst part? I knew. Deep down, I'd known all along. I just didn't want to admit that I'd bet my whole life on someone who was already gone. I called Carol. I need you to hear something, I said. She came over with that urgency only real friends have, no questions asked. I played her the voicemail James accidentally left me the week he moved out. It was short. Savannah's voice laughing. Do you think she'll ever figure it out? James, she's too soft. She still thinks we're just going through a rough patch. More laughter. Then silence. Then the click of a door closing. Carol didn't say anything for a long time. Then she whispered, You kept all this? I nodded. I thought I was crazy. I needed proof that I wasn't. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. You're not crazy, she said. You're terrifying. I smiled. Just a little. Because I knew she was right. I wasn't broken anymore. I was sharpening. And if they thought they'd walked away clean, they had no idea what was coming next. The next morning I met with my lawyer. Yes, I had a lawyer. People assumed I was just a teacher, just a wife. But before James, I'd inherited a property portfolio from my grandmother. Quiet money. Generational. She taught me how to hide it well. I never needed to brag, and James never bothered to ask. When we married, I agreed to keep finances separate. He thought it was a romantic gesture of trust. I knew it was strategy. Because while James had been out chasing flashy tech deals, I'd been collecting leases, investing in land, and expanding my holdings. I owned 3 buildings in Portland outright, including the one where his new cafe resided. He never knew. Savannah certainly didn't. And now? They were paying me rent. I could have laughed. I didn't, but I could have. Instead, I instructed my lawyer to review the lease agreement, see if there were clauses they'd violated by making unauthorized renovations or holding events without permits. There were. Dozens. He blinked, then asked, "You sure you want to go after them?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not going after them. I'm taking back what's mine." Carol was the first person I told. She spilled her coffee. Literally. "Wait, you own the building they're operating in? Since before they started dating? And you never said anything?" "No one ever asked." She stared at me in awe. "Eliza, you're not just surviving, you're playing chess." I smiled, because I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. I was building leverage, quietly, powerfully. Then I reached out to an old college friend, Lucas. He was a real estate developer now with a specialty in restoring historical properties. I asked if he was interested in a new project. Told him I had a building in mind. He agreed to meet. When he showed up, he looked me over, then smiled like he'd just uncovered a hidden gem. "Eliza Monroe," he said, shaking his head. "You've been hiding in plain sight." I didn't correct him, because yes, I had. But not anymore, because now it was my turn to move. And I wasn't just a woman scorned. I was the owner of their kingdom. The invitation arrived by accident, at least I thought it was. It was tucked between my mail, an elegant ivory card with gold embossing. "Ryan Collins and Savannah Blair invite you to celebrate their engagement." I stared at it for 10 minutes. Was it a cruel joke? A twisted show of power? Carol thought I should ignore it. "He wants you to see him happy. Don't give him that." But something inside me burned. Not from jealousy, but from the need to face it. Not for him. For me. The event was at a rooftop lounge downtown. I wore a simple black dress, one that didn't cling too tightly to my 6-month belly. I didn't come to make a scene. I came to witness the man who discarded me. I walked in, heads turned. Some recognized me. A few whispered. Then I saw him. Ryan. In a tailored suit, laughing, holding Savannah's hand like she was spun from gold. She wore white. When he saw me, his smile froze. Just for a second. Then he leaned in and whispered something into her ear. Savannah's eyes narrowed. She walked toward me, wineglass in hand. "Well," she smiled, too wide, too bright. "Didn't expect to see you here. Thought you'd be home knitting baby socks." I ignored the jab. "Congratulations." She glanced at my belly. "How far along?" 6 months. She took a sip. "Still clinging to what's not yours?" The music dulled. People turned toward us. "Ryan never loved you," she continued. "You were convenient, a mistake." I felt the blood drain from my face. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Then Ryan joined her, arm around her waist, that same smug smirk from the voicemail. "You shouldn't be here," he said coldly. "This isn't your world anymore." His voice wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. People stared, some in pity, others in awkward silence. I stood there, frozen, like a child being scolded in public. "I just came to congratulate you," I whispered. "That's all." Savannah laughed. "Well, mission accomplished. Now go back to whatever you do all day." Ryan leaned closer. "It's embarrassing, Eliza, you showing up like this. Pitiful." Something in me cracked. I looked around the room, the lights, the polished smiles, the faces pretending not to look. And then I felt it. My baby kicked. Hard. It grounded me. I straightened my shoulders. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't belong here. I never did." I turned around, walked out slowly. No tears, no breakdown, only silence. When I got to the sidewalk, I sat down on a bench. I should have felt humiliated, destroyed. But all I felt was clear. They had shown me who they were. Finally, without masks, and something in me whispered, this wasn't my end, it was my beginning. After the gala, I went home and cried. Not the soft, silent kind of tears, the kind you swallow and pretend never happened. No, these were ugly, shaking sobs. I cried on the bathroom floor with my dress still on, makeup smeared and hair falling out of its pins. Because even though I'd walked in like I owned the room, inside, I still felt like the girl who'd been abandoned. Savannah had cornered me just before the gala ended. "I see you found ways to stay relevant," she said, sipping champagne. I said nothing. She leaned in closer. "Just remember, power is perception, and people like you fade." She smiled sweetly, then walked off. And for a moment, I believed her. I sat up that night, holding my stomach, whispering to my baby, "I'm trying, I promise. I just don't know if I have anything left." That was the truth. For all the files I'd collected, the leverage I held, the buildings I owned, I was still one woman, pregnant, tired, alone, until the next morning. That's when the letter came. It was handwritten, elegant, from my grandmother's lawyer. Inside, a copy of her final trust amendments. She had changed them just months before she passed. And in her neat cursive she wrote, "To Eliza, because you have always carried others quietly, I leave you not just property, but full rights to Munro Holdings. It is yours now. Do with it what I could not. Use it loudly." I stared at the words, full control, of the company, the assets, the staff. I had thought I was just a landlord, but I wasn't. I was CEO. Carol screamed when I told her. "Wait, you have a whole company?" I didn't know it was all under me. I thought I was just a passive heir. "No, babe. You're the storm. You're the boardroom." And suddenly, everything shifted. Not because of a man, not because of revenge, but because a woman before me, my grandmother, had quietly laid the foundation for a different kind of legacy. And now it was mine. The following week, I walked into the Munro Holdings boardroom for the first time, not as a visitor, not as a family member, but as the rightful owner. The room was sleek, glass walls, black marble table, leather chairs, a far cry from the classrooms and coffee shops I was used to. But I didn't shrink. I adjusted. A man in a gray suit stood up when I entered. "Ms. Munro?" "Yes. I'm Daniel, your grandmother's former CFO. We've all been waiting for you." I nodded, sat at the head of the table and opened the folder he handed me. Assets, holdings, developments, cash reserves, charities. It was bigger than I imagined, and every signature required my approval now. I felt something shift in me, like a long dormant switch had been flipped. "I'd like to review the lease files for 415 Belmont Avenue," I said without looking up. Daniel blinked. "The cafe?" I smiled. "Yes, that one." That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the office, ordered food, and mapped out a plan. Not of revenge, but of redefinition. I would reclaim the parts of me I'd been taught to hide. The ambition, the sharpness, the refusal to be erased. Lucas called just after midnight. "You up for a site visit tomorrow?" he asked. "Absolutely." He paused. "Eliza, you sound different." I looked out the window of my office, city lights flickering below. "I am. Because once, I was the woman who held everything together behind the scenes. Now, I was the woman in charge of the stage, and I just decided it was time to change the script. I didn't announce anything, no press release, no social media post, no dramatic declaration. That wasn't my style. Instead, I started showing up differently. I hired a stylist, not for vanity, for armor, structured blazers, neutral tones, fabrics that whispered quiet wealth. I cut my hair shorter, sharper, more defined. It felt like shedding dead weight. People noticed. At meetings, eyes lingered longer. Doors opened faster. No one asked who I was anymore. They assumed I was someone important. Because I moved like it. Lucas took me to see the cafe building under the guise of a maintenance inspection. I walked through slowly, silently, with a clipboard in hand and a private architect trailing behind me. Savannah wasn't there. James was. He came out from the back, surprised. "What's going on?" I smiled. "Routine assessment, fire code updates, lease compliance." His eyes narrowed. "You can't just show up unannounced." I tilted my head. "I'm the owner, James. I don't need an appointment." He didn't respond. I leaned in slightly. "How's business?" He mumbled something about soft openings and investor dinners. I handed him a sealed envelope. "What's this?" "A notice. You violated multiple terms of your lease agreement, unauthorized modifications, hosting public events without permits, late payments." His face turned pale. I kept my voice calm. "Even. You have 30 days to vacate or remedy the violations in full. If not, Munro Holdings will proceed with termination." He stared at me. "You're serious?" I smiled faintly. "I'm always serious when it comes to my property." And then I turned and walked out. No raised voices, no threats. Just truth. Just consequences. Back in the car, Lucas looked over at me. "You sure you want to play it this way?" I nodded. Quiet power. No scandal. Just precision. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. And justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up. Exactly when they least expect it. Within a week of delivering the notice, small cracks began to appear in their perfect world. Vendors started pulling out of their launch event. Suppliers delayed shipments. City inspectors arrived, unprompted. Savannah posted vague, passive-aggressive stories on social media. Some people just can't stand to see others shine. The comments were full of sympathy. But behind closed doors, I heard from my lawyer that James had already reached out, desperately, trying to renegotiate the lease. I didn't respond, because this wasn't about one building. It was about pattern. They built their life on stolen foundation, and now that foundation was shifting. Carol kept asking, "Are you going to tell the world what they did?" But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I hosted a charity brunch under Monroe Holdings. Quiet, elegant, exclusive. I invited women in business, real estate developers, city officials, people who didn't just read headlines, they wrote them. Savannah showed up, uninvited. She walked in late, hair perfect, smile bright, but something about her eyes was frantic. She made her way over with a glass of champagne like we were old friends. "Eliza," she said too cheerfully. "We should talk." I turned to face her fully. "Is that so?" She glanced around, lowered her voice. "I know you're upset. I get it, but hurting James like this, it's not going to bring him back." I stared at her, calm, steady. Then I said, "Savannah, you think this is about James?" Her smile faltered. I stepped closer. "You're playing checkers on a chessboard, and I've been planning this move since before you even knew my name." Then I walked away. The next day, my legal team filed a formal eviction. James and Savannah were given 28 days. No exceptions. And in the background, I bought the neighboring building. Lucas smiled when I signed the final document. "So what's the plan?" "New cafe," I said. "Open it 2 weeks before theirs closes." He laughed. "You're ruthless." "No," I said, "I'm ready." Because I didn't just survive their betrayal, I built something stronger in its ashes. And now I was building it out loud. The day of my cafe's grand opening arrived. It wasn't just another coffee shop, it was a statement. A 2-story, light-filled space with floor-to-ceiling windows, handcrafted furniture from local artists, a reading nook for families, and organic baked goods from women-owned businesses. I named it Second Light, because that's what it felt like, a second chance to step into my own brightness. Lucas stood beside me at the ribbon cutting. Carol was there too, holding my hand as I took a deep breath before stepping into the spotlight. Reporters showed up, cameras flashed. I gave a brief speech, not about revenge, not about the past, but about rebirth. "Second Light is more than a space," I said. "It's proof that even after you've been burned, you can still glow." The applause was real. So were the tears in some of the women's eyes. And across the street, James and Savannah stood outside their cafe staring. They had planned their soft reopening for the same day, hoping to outshine me. But their staff looked nervous. Their foot traffic slowed. The noise from our celebration drowned out their music. I didn't gloat. I didn't wave. I simply turned to my customers and smiled. Because they came to me. Inside, I spotted a familiar face, City Councilwoman Green, who had previously refused James's sponsorship requests. She ordered a latte, shook my hand, and said, "You've turned this block into something real, Eliza. We're watching." Later that week, an article ran in the local press. From abandoned to architect, how one woman built a movement with a cafe. No mention of James, no room for Savannah, just me. And it wasn't revenge, it was recognition. Because this time I wasn't proving anything to them. I was honoring everything I'd built without them. By the second week, lines wrapped around the block outside Second Light. Customers posted glowing reviews. Influencers tagged the cafe in stories. A local TV station aired a feature, "The Woman Who Rebuilt More Than a Business." And the best part? I wasn't even in the interview. It was my staff, single moms, immigrants, artists, talking about the workplace I'd created. A place built on care, dignity, and second chances. Meanwhile, across the street, things were unraveling. A former employee of James's cafe posted a TikTok, revealing missed paychecks and toxic work conditions. It went viral. Then, a food safety inspector cited them for 3 violations. Someone filed a complaint about fire code issues. The city began investigating. I hadn't lifted a finger. The consequences weren't mine to deliver. They'd been baked into every selfish decision James and Savannah had made. I simply let gravity do its job. One afternoon, I walked into my cafe and Carol met me with wide eyes. "You need to see this." She handed me a tablet. On the screen, a real estate listing. Charming cafe space on Belmont Ave, newly vacated, motivated seller. I blinked. There, Selling? James can't keep up with payments. Investors pulled out. Savannah deleted her business page this morning. I exhaled. Long, quiet. It was over. Not with a bang. With a fade. That night, I stood at the balcony of my office, lights from Second Light glowing behind me. Lucas came out and handed me a cup of tea. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We just stood there watching the quiet fall over the block I once thought would haunt me forever. And then I smiled. Because there is no sweeter justice than rising so high they can't even touch your shadow anymore. 2 weeks after they listed the cafe for sale, I got a call from my lawyer. "You should see this," he said. He forwarded an email chain. Inside were documents from a former investor in James's business, detailing falsified projections, inflated customer counts, and forged supplier contracts. James had lied to secure funding. And Savannah, she had co-signed half the paperwork. Fraud. Not speculation. Not gossip. Evidence. My lawyer looked at me. "This could go to court." I nodded. "Let it." Carol clapped when I told her. Finally. They're not just losing reputation, they're facing real consequences. I didn't feel giddy. I felt steady, resolved. Because it wasn't about vengeance anymore, it was about closure. The following Monday, an article broke in the Portland Business Journal. Popular cafe duo accused of investor fraud, legal action pending. Names were named, details were printed, screenshots were leaked. James disappeared from social media. Now, Savannah posted a vague apology, something about being misled by someone she trusted. But it was too late. The investors filed suit. The city retracted their community recognition awards. And the cafe, already closed, was vandalized overnight with red paint across the glass. Thieves. I didn't know who did it. I didn't ask. Instead, I walked past the building one morning on my way to work. The for sale sign hung crooked. Flyers were peeling off the door. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel a pull in my chest. Just peace. Just air. Because the place that once symbolized betrayal was now just real estate. A failed deal. Nothing more. And as for James and Savannah, they didn't just lose each other. They lost the image, the power, the story. And I didn't have to ruin them. They did it all themselves. A month after the lawsuit hit, James was arrested. Fraud, forgery, breach of contract. It was quiet. No handcuffs in front of cameras, no dramatic headlines, but the court records were public. And once the media caught wind, it spread fast. Savannah wasn't charged, yet, but she was subpoenaed. And in this city, that was enough. Her brand deals dried up. Sponsors backed out. She tried to rebrand as a wellness coach online, but comments flooded her posts. "Did your wellness plan include stealing someone's husband? Any tips for surviving bankruptcy?" She shut her accounts down after that. I watched it all from my office, silent, still. I didn't cheer, I didn't smirk, because this wasn't a movie. It was real life, real consequences. And in real life, justice isn't always loud. It's slow, relentless, inevitable. Lucas asked me once, "Do you feel better now?" I thought about it. Not better, clearer, freer. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't hoping for validation. I wasn't obsessing over what they did or didn't suffer. Because they weren't part of my story anymore. They were a chapter. Closed, filed, done. I had a business to run, a baby to prepare for, a future to build. Carol said something one night that stayed with me. The best revenge is being so rooted in your own life, you forget you were ever betrayed. And she was right. Because I forgot about them more and more every day. Not out of denial, out of growth. And when James stood in court, surrounded by everything he'd destroyed, the only thing I felt was this. Peace. Pure, undisturbed peace. 3 months later, I gave birth. A girl. She came early. Strong lungs, 10 fingers, unapologetically loud. I named her Grace. Not because life had been gentle, but because I had survived it with grace. Lucas was the first person at the hospital besides Carol. He brought flowers. Not pink, not blue, just wild ones, bright, free. He held her like he'd done it 100 times before. Then looked at me and whispered, "You did it." I nodded. Because I had. Not just the pregnancy, not just the cafe, but the transformation. I was no longer the woman who questioned her worth, who waited for someone to choose her, who shrank to make others comfortable. I was someone who had burned and rebuilt, and now I had something to pass on, something deeper than wealth or legacy. Dignity. That's what I wanted my daughter to inherit. The weeks that followed were quieter. No more courtrooms, no more press. Just long mornings at Second Light, holding Grace while customers cooed over her. Carol visited often, Lucas too. My staff became family. The business ran smoother than ever. One afternoon, I sat at the window table, breastfeeding Grace while sunlight poured in. An older woman approached me. I recognized her. She'd been at the gala, but we hadn't spoken. She placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "I don't know the full story," she said softly, "but I watched you walk into that room like you owned the ground under your feet. And now I sit here, in this place you built, and I feel safe, seen." I blinked back tears. "Thank you," I whispered. She smiled. "No, dear. Thank you for reminding women like me that it's never too late to become someone new." And that was it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just my story anymore. It was ours. Every woman who had ever been broken and decided to rebuild anyway. That night, after I put Grace to sleep, I sat on my balcony, same place I once stood watching James's cafe fall apart. But this time, I wasn't looking at the past. I was dreaming forward. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas. "Board meeting confirmed. They want you to speak at the Women's Leadership Summit next month." I smiled. This used to be unimaginable. Me? Invited to speak? But now? It felt right, because I had something to say. Not about betrayal, but about becoming. The next morning I started writing my speech. I wrote about how healing isn't linear, how some days you'll feel like you've won, and others you'll still hear their laughter in the back of your mind. But you keep going, because dignity is built in silence, in showing up, in choosing yourself again and again. I wrote about legacy, not just the kind you inherit, but the kind you earn. And I wrote about women, the ones who stayed, the ones who left, the ones who rebuilt, even when no one was watching. I ended with this. They say women are fragile, that we break too easily. But what they don't say is, we know how to mend, and in our mending, we become unbreakable. The crowd stood when I finished. Some cried. Carol hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Lucas whispered, "You changed the room." But I knew it wasn't just that room. It was every woman watching. Every woman who had ever felt discarded, underestimated, or silenced. I wasn't just Eliza Monroe anymore. I was proof. Proof that you can lose everything, your marriage, your name, your pride, and still come back more powerful, more peaceful, more you than ever before. And as I walked off the stage and saw Grace clapping in the audience, just a baby but already radiant, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. This was my beginning.